Hello and welcome to today's webinar on quality principles for competency-based education. Before we get started, let me just point out some logistics. On your screen in the lower left-hand corner, you will see a chat area, a chat room. Please feel free to introduce yourself. The chat's a vital part of the conversation. Please enter your questions in this chat room as we go through. We will have time to respond to questions at several points throughout the webinar and time for Q&A at the end. But first, just use the chat room to introduce yourself, where you're from, and your work in competency-based education. Next, please know this webinar will be recorded and archived. These materials will be archived on the competencyworks.org website and the wiki. We have just started the recording and we'll begin. So please let me start by introducing our presenters today, the authors of the quality book, Quality Principles for Competency-Based Education. This book is available for free download with the link. And again, welcome for today's webinar. This webinar will provide highlights and insights in the recently published book. Our speakers today are Chris Sturgis and Katherine Casey. Chris Sturgis is co-founder of Competency Works and founder of Learning Edge, a consulting firm dedicated to modernizing our education system. She is a prolific writer about personalized learning and competency education. She was awarded the Innovator Award at iNACOL 2018. Chris will be leaving Competency Works at the end of December and will continue to write about new insights in our understanding of the field of competency education at learningedge.me. Katherine Casey is founder and principal of Katherine Casey Consulting, an independent organization focused on innovation, personalized and competency-based school design, and research and development. Katherine was a founding director of the Imaginarium Innovation Lab at Denver Public Schools, supporting a portfolio of almost 30 schools across Denver and spearheading the lab's research and development activity. Katherine was a founding design team member at the Denver School of Innovation and Sustainable Design, Denver's first competency-based high school. Prior to her time in Denver, Katherine worked in leadership development, philanthropy, public affairs, and higher education. She received her bachelor's from Stanford University and her doctorate in education leadership from Harvard University. Her dissertation, titled Innovation and Inclusion by Design, Reimagining Learning, Remembering Brown, explored the intersection of school design and integration in Denver. Please join me in welcoming our presenters, and I will turn it over to you, Katherine. Thank you.
Oops, this is Chris. I'm going to jump in. So sorry about that, everybody. I just wanted to just explain that the quality book that we've produced was actually part of the whole National Summit on K-12 Competency-Based Education. And at that meeting, which was in 2017, we actually looked at 4 big issues, and you can find documents on all of these at Competency Works. But we really looked at equity, and there's a whole paper on that, meeting students where they are, and the redesign team took the lead there. There's a document about policy, which is about how to create a sustaining set of policies, not how to get districts and schools to become competency-based, but once they are, how do we set up that set of policies to work? And then the last one, which has been the most comprehensive, has been this work on quality. So I just want to make sure that you all understood the context of where this fits in. Okay, Katherine, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Chris. And welcome everyone to today's call. I'm going to briefly open us up by discussing our learning objectives and talking a little bit about what is in the quality book. So first, the objectives for today are initially to describe the contents of the book at a high level and to give you a sense of what the work product contains. Second, we want to really engage a discussion about the connection between quality and equity, why we think quality is so essential for schools, districts, and states to be able to achieve competency-based education's vision of greater equity for all students. Third, we want to provide an overview of the quality principles themselves. And then fourth, we want to conclude by having a discussion about how you as practitioners can begin to use the quality principles in practice in the field. So we want to start to bridge that research and practice gap by showcasing a number of tools that have been or could be developed, again, to make that research and practice connection. So very briefly, the quality book, for any of you who have looked at it or read it, it's comprehensive and it's long. So we want to give you a sense of the book at a high level, since we won't be able to cover all of the content today. So the beginning section of the book is what we would sort of consider a CBE primer. So we define what competency-based education means. We discuss some of the flaws in the traditional system that competency-based education responds to and addresses. And we distill some distinguishing features that really help to clarify what exactly competency-based education is. Next, the book describes 16 quality principles for designing competency-based districts and schools. These are broken into 3 categories: purpose and culture, teaching and learning, and structure. And this organization reflects the idea that competency-based education is a cultural, pedagogical, and structural innovation. Within each of the 16 principles, what you'll see when you dig into the book is that there is a description of the principle and a few sort of distinguishing or notable features of that principle. There's a discussion about how it relates to quality and often how it relates to equity as well. And then at the end of each section, or each principle rather, there are specific look-fors, and these are meant to help you crystallize, clarify your understanding of the principle by saying, what would you expect to see if you walked into a classroom or school or district and this principle were alive and well? And relatedly, some red flags, right? What would you see if this principle were not present in the classroom or school or district into which you entered? So that's an overview of the book itself. I'm going to pass it back over to Chris to give us an overview of competency-based education.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Okay, so usually we start off these discussions with my describing what competency-based education is, but we are going to dig deeper into the quality principles in this. So I just want to make sure that you all understand that the section 1 in the quality principles book is really a primer on competency-based education. And what you can find is a discussion on the 10 distinguishing features, which you see here, but I'm not going into them, but you can read all about them. And if anybody has any questions regarding any of these, just stick them in the chat room and I can engage with you there to make sure you understand them. And if you want examples about what they look like in different schools, I'm happy to provide those too in the chat room. The other thing you're going to find in the quality book is the flaws in the traditional system. And we have found that this ends up being very, very important to understand, because Catherine mentioned red flags. Well, these problems of practice that we're finding in the field, and they're serious. I mean, we have a serious quality problem. I think a lot of them start by not understanding the belief systems in the traditional system. And so here's an example. Let's say you think intelligence is set in stone, right? Kind of more of a fixed mindset. Well, then you're going to start to believe that some kids are going to learn and some aren't. So why not just deliver the curriculum to the one, and then those who learn will get A's and B's, and those that don't will just kind of get passed along, and that's okay. And all of a sudden we're ranking and sorting kids. But here's what happens. Our teachers would actually start to lose a sense of efficacy. If they don't believe that they can really teach kids, then they're not going to feel very empowered about doing so. And all of a sudden our schools start to lose a sense of accountability and responsibility, because guess what? We actually believe somewhere deep in our minds that some kids aren't really going to learn anyway. And so shifting that, and I'll tell you, the other day I discovered I had empty vessels, kids as empty vessels, kind of shaping how I was interpreting some information. And it was amazing. It kind of slipped in out of nowhere, this old belief system. So getting smart about the flaws is really important. And on page 19 of the paper, you're going to find a chart that compares the traditional and the competency-based systems. And then another resource that could be really helpful, I'm going to give all the credit to Katherine on this, but the development of the paper Lovers and Logic Models goes deeper and deeper into how these pieces fit together to make a positive, virtuous cycle of learning. And so those are all the resources that you've got. And as soon as I'm done talking, I can answer any questions. So hopefully you've all seen this big, beautiful circle of the 16 quality principles. One of the things that came back from the summit was that we shouldn't just focus on the structure of a competency-based system. It was equally as important to talk about the purpose and culture, and it was equally as important to talk about the teaching and learning. And of course, it's not just talking about it. When we try to transition from from the traditional system to competency-based education, it's really important to be working on culture, pedagogy, and the structure simultaneously. And what you'll find that's very different about this set of 16 quality principles is we put advancement of mastery at the very end as the 16th quality principle, because what we realized was that it was accumulative. You really had to have all the other ones in place to some degree to make that work. So what I also want to make a big connection for you all is before we did the quality principles, we did the equity principles. And I bet if we had done this simultaneously, they would have been exactly the same. But they are highly overlapping, and you will essentially find all the equity principles in the quality principles. But the last three that I want to bring your attention to are written slightly differently in the equity principles, and I think it's because of how important the emphasis is. One is to monitor and respond to progress, proficiency, and pace. Somehow along the way, people started to talk about competency-based education as self-paced, and partially that is driven by the traditional belief systems that schools are just delivering curriculum versus teaching students. So it's not really that time is a variable, but it's instructional support is a variable. And so monitoring that kids are getting what they actually need to be making progress is super important. And pace isn't a pace of the delivery of the curriculum, but it's understanding that kids are working in their own zones of proximal development, and they may be longer for some and shorter for some in terms of what they're having to learn in order to reach those grade level goals or beyond, and making sure the kids are actually making the level of progress they need to given what they're focused on. Because if they're repairing gaps, it is going to take longer. They are not slower. They're actually learning more things. Second one is the adult mindset. This issue about, again, embracing the science of learning, embracing the new belief systems, the new sense of culture, how to create an inclusive culture, are all very important to making sure that kids are willing to put their best effort forward. But bias is, we all have bias. It's always there. It's always shaping our decisions and how we're interpreting things. And creating that commitment and collegial relationships with people to help you identify bias. And boy, even in writing these papers, I had a lot of people saying, Chris, you're taking a deficit orientation. Chris, you're taking a deficit orientation. Now, I'm not sure I'm over it all yet, but I'm certainly aware of when I'm doing it now. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues for helping me understand that. And then the third one is really about continuous improvement. But when we think about continuous improvement, it's both about improving the school performance overall, but it's also about responding immediately to those kids not getting what they need, right? Or not getting the support they need to excel. And so it's both a short run continuous improvement where it's about responsiveness to kids, and the long run, which is about changing your practices and policies in order to be that everybody is benefiting. So I just want to make sure that when you're reading the quality principles, you're also thinking about those equity principles. So let me stop. Susan, were there any questions that need to be discussed?
Please type your questions in the chat room. There was one comment that just reiterated the importance of the phrase positive virtuous cycle of learning, considering how important faculty professional learning is. for this to happen, to ensure equitable, inclusive, competency-based ed for students, and tying that professional learning with faculty members and that ongoing cycle of learning to student learning. There were no additional questions, so feel free to type those in the chat room if anyone has questions on that first section.
Beth, I do think that the stronger we become at identifying when there's a virtuous cycle of learning and when there's a vicious cycle of learning happening is really important. Susan and I have talked a lot about how do you create a system of learning and organizations for learning that generate trust, because trust is such a necessary ingredient for learning. But we have schools across America that are driven by fear, right? Because we've been doing blame and shame for so long. People are just shut down from the superintendent, right, all the way down to your paraprofessionals. There's a compliance mentality, keep your head down, just do what you're being asked. And that's a vicious cycle. And what we need to do is get really smart at being able to identify when virtuous cycles are starting to grow a little bit and really nurturing those and letting them build up. So I'll just stop there, and I'm going to now turn this over to Katherine to start to delve into the quality principles. And again, we're going to stop for questions afterwards, so please put in any questions or reactions. And what we love to hear about any kind of lessons you've learned where you've made mistakes, like these kind of red flags, and how you made mid-course corrections. That's really like the most valuable learning we can do as a field. Katherine.
Thank you, Chris. So I have the Herculean task of trying to talk through 16 very important quality principles in about 15 minutes. So what I want to say at the outset here is that I'm not going to cover all 16 quality principles. It's just not possible. I will reference a select number of principles within each of the 3 sections. But in doing that, I want to make sure I'm clear that all of these principles are important and they work in tandem. So my selection really does not imply any kind of higher order of priority for the principles that I will speak to. So I'll begin with the purpose and culture section, and there are 5 principles here. Purpose-driven, commit to equity, nurture a culture of learning and inclusivity, foster the development of a growth mindset, and cultivate empowering and distributed leadership. I will speak to 2 of these, and those are purpose-driven and commit to equity. So purpose-driven, what does this say? Well, first this says that creating a common vision and purpose is essential for achieving quality and competency-based education. And in addition to that, it is really important that engagement of students, educators, families, and leaders be authentic and be consistent throughout that process of shaping and then refining a vision. And in most systems, this will mean leadership actively engaging voices that have traditionally been on the margins. And here, it's helpful to think about both the process and the outcomes that are important. So the trust that is built through the open process of creating a vision, and then that result, right? A vision that will guide the rest of the work through all of the trials and tribulations of implementation. The principle also says that a purpose for a competency-based system is a vision for student success that broadens what it means to be successful. So that looks not only at academic competencies, but also at the habits, skills, and personal attributes of thriving young adults. So what might you look for here? Remember, there are going to be look-fors and red flags in each of these sections. What might you look for? So you can ask any teacher or student about the purpose of learning in their school, and they can tell you. You might also see as a look-for in a system that is solidly purpose-driven. We also hear that beyond talking about whole child and 21st century competencies, these are reflected in the way that schools, educators, and learners are evaluated. And what might be an example of a red flag? So one that I'll highlight here is that if the shift is happening, right, if competency-based education is being implemented in a school or district because it was mandatory, because someone said it had to, that is a red flag, right? Acting out of compliance is not consistent with the idea of having an authentic, community-driven vision for competency-based learning. The second principle in this section is commit to equity. So this says that, we all know that at its core, competency-based ed is a strategy designed to increase equity. But we can't just assume that CBE, the competency-based ed, will lead to greater equity on its own. We have to design for it. So this principle specifies that equity has to be core to the vision, mission, and operations of a school. Specifically, that a school or district shares a common purpose of ensuring all students can succeed. But beyond that, this can't be lip service, right? We see a lot of schools in the traditional realm that talk about all students being successful, but then don't organize themselves in accordance with that vision and that commitment. So in a competency-based system designed for quality, right, you would see that a school is focusing its resources and energy on making sure this is true. You would see this show up in resource allocation, culturally responsive pedagogy, the diversity of staff, and efforts to root out individual and institutional bias. So in a system committed to equity, what would be some look-fors? Right? One would be that the school or district has a vision that states every student can succeed, or that envisions every student succeeding. Another might be really seeing an equity lens being used in resource allocation. Another look-for could be proactive and consistent engagement of multiple sections of the community in decision-making. And also, and this is a really sort of on-the-ground one, right, that students in schools will tell you they have strong relationships with their teachers and they feel proud of who they are in school. Red flags about equity, right, these might be related, you can see them all over the place. Two might be students being grouped and tracked by ability level in an effort to differentiate. Or you might see that students who are behind, right, students who are not yet meeting expectations, not having any opportunities to engage in deeper learning, deeper or meaningful learning. So those are two principles I'll touch on here within this section, and then I want to call your attention to some additional resources that may be helpful to you as you and your school or district or team think about what to do with these principles. One is a paper called Designing for Equity. This is what Chris mentioned or referenced a moment ago, and this looks specifically at equity strategies. So as Chris noted, these two resources can be really helpful when read in relationship to one another. And the second, and this is related to the idea of a broader purpose for learning and that purpose-driven principle. It's a fantastic framework called Building Blocks for Learning from Turnaround for Children, which really helps to clarify what that broader definition of student success could look like. So please consider checking out those two resources if you want to delve into this section of the paper. Next, I'll move into the set of principles related to teaching and learning. All right, so the teaching and learning principles basically describe how pedagogy, curriculum, instruction, and assessment contribute to quality. And here there are 4 principles that we look at. Base school design and pedagogy on the learning sciences, activate student agency and ownership, design for the development of rigorous higher level skills, and ensure responsiveness. Here again I'll speak to 2. I'll speak to design for the development of rigorous higher level skills and ensure responsiveness. So what does it mean to design for the development of rigorous higher level skills? Now this states that, as we just discussed, the first principle talks about articulating a vision of student success that goes beyond academics. And what this principle does is build on that and say to achieve that vision, you have to design learning environments and learning experiences that prioritize, emphasize, and actively develop those knowledge and skills. And so this shows up right in deep pedagogy and curriculum that support application and transfer, in authentic and performance-based assessments, and also in adult development that helps teachers understand how they can develop and assess these skills for students. There are a lot of look-fors here. I'll touch on just 1 or 2. So one is that if you walk into a school or district, beyond seeing a vision for higher order skills and real-world competencies, you would see learning happening that support them. So for example, you might see that all students have opportunities to regularly engage in projects that connect their learning to the real world. You might see rigorous performance-based assessment happening. And I think this is a really important one. You would see that educators have time to collaborate to make sure that they can calibrate their assessments of student learning, right? So that all the teachers in a building or in a district have the same idea of what it means to demonstrate those higher order skills. Now, red flags around this one could be, for example, a school or district that talks about 21st century skills but continues to rely on scope and sequence or standardized summative assessment on the daily. So the ninth principle is in this section is ensure responsiveness. And this one has to do with meeting students where they are. And in some ways here I think we're talking about what Chris referenced earlier around monitoring progress and pace. So traditional education sort of works on two myths, right? One is that the best way to help students, or the best definition of rigor, is teaching students at grade level no matter where they are in their learning. And the myth that if a student is behind, or if they're not yet at level, then they're incapable of doing high-level work. So part of what we're going to talk about here is disrupting those two myths. But to Chris's point, this is also about disrupting the myth that self-paced learning, or just teaching a student where they are without attention to their progress and pace, is enough to ensure quality or equity. So competency-based schools actively meet students where they are. They engage them in the appropriate level of stretch and what you could call productive struggle, or their zone of proximal development, and they provide the right supports at the right time. And they make sure that students are engaging in higher order thinking no matter where they are in their learning, right? So all students get to experience challenging, deeper learning. And finally, that really critical piece, again, about paying attention to progress and pace. So meeting students where they are, being responsive, means more than self-paced. It means helping students make meaningful and adequate progress. Here, too, there could be a lot of look-fors. I'll just draw on a couple. One is you might see schools using a learner continuum to describe the development of knowledge and skills over time, and it spans several grade levels rather than grade level standards alone. And you would see strong data systems that help educators actively monitor progress and pace. Right? Red flags might be all students working on the same grade level content without any differentiation, or, and this kind of ties back to that adult mindset piece that Chris mentioned earlier, the use of terms like fast or slow learners, which imply a fixed mindset about learning and progress. So here in this section as well, I want to point you to a few additional resources that may be of use to you and to your team as you seek to bring these principles into action in your context. One is a paper called Meeting Students Where They Are, which really identifies very specific instructional and structural strategies for being responsive, monitoring progress and pace, all of the things we just talked about in that last principle. And the other is a site called Deeper Learning for All, and this really provides a wealth of resources and strategies about how to develop higher order skills through instruction and school design. Okay, moving on to the third section here, the structure quality principles. So structure really describes how systems and structures, so it's sort of like the architecture of a school or a district or even a state, how that architecture contributes to quality. And there are 7 design principles in this section. Seek intentionality and alignment, establish mechanisms to ensure consistency and reliability, maximize transparency, invest in educators as learners, increase organizational flexibility, develop processes for ongoing continuous improvement and organizational learning, and advance upon demonstrated mastery. I'm going to talk about 3 in this section because it's obviously a large section. There's a substantial amount of really good content here. The first principle I'll speak to is seek intentionality and alignment. So what does this say? Basically, this says that to design for quality, you have to see the system, your classroom, your school, or your district, as a whole. Right? And this is sort of related to work on a learning organization, which talks about systems thinking as a critical part of learning improvement and change. You could also think of it sort of like a car engine, right? All the parts have to work together for the system to operate. So in this case, we mean how do the learning sciences, how do equity strategies, how do local context inform design, right? And then we mean how do the outcomes of learning inform design? And we think about how do all the parts work together, right? How do the competencies and learning continuum, the curriculum, the pedagogy, assessment, data systems, adult education, professional development, how do these all reinforce each other in working toward a larger whole and working toward that vision? What might you look for in a system that's really modeling that intentionality and alignment, right? So one very specific example, you might see that there are assessments that are aligned to the vision of a graduate or the graduate profile and the learning continuum, right? So there's an assessment, curriculum, instruction, alignment. You can also see professional learning for adults aligned to expectations for student learning. And you may see opportunities actually for leaders and teachers to study alignment, right? That the reflection on the alignment in the system is actually a part of the continuous improvement model and approach that happens at all levels on an ongoing basis. Red flags, right? So red flags might include, and I think I've referenced this before, right? A vision of a graduate or a graduate profile emphasizing competencies that don't show up anywhere in the curriculum and aren't ever assessed. Or you might see reliance on traditional sit-and-get professional development in a system that's trying to get teachers to shift towards student-centered instruction in their classrooms. So that's what I'll share for intentionality and alignment. I'm going to move on to the 13th principle, which is invest in educators as learners. What does this one say? Well, this principle essentially says that there is no way to make the shift to competency-based education, or for that matter to sustain high levels of quality in competency-based education without continually developing teachers. Full stop. And beyond that, the way we develop teachers in quality competency-based education systems absolutely has to reflect the types of learning we expect them to facilitate for students in the classroom. And it has to be linked to their passions and purpose, while also directly connected to improving their ability to support students in the classroom. So you might think about sort of professional development and learning as learner-centered in two senses. One, it is based in teachers' own needs as adult learners, and two, it's directly tied to student learning and feedback. A couple of look-fors here, right? Things you might see in a system that's really investing in their educators as learners. One is that there's clarity about educator competencies, right? That it is clear to teachers and leaders in the systems like what competencies we want educators to demonstrate, and that those are directly connected to student competencies and student learning. Again, you want to see that alignment between professional learning and student learning, and you want to see opportunities for collaboration embedded into the school day. Sort of in the inverse of that, right? Red flags might be collaboration that has to happen outside of school time or in teachers' free time, or a lack of collaboration altogether. Or, right, you might see teachers working on student-centered learning in their classrooms, but sitting in direct instruction, sit and get professional development with no room for personalization and no opportunity for sustained practice. So this one is really, really critical. The final principle I will speak to is the very last principle, number 16, advance upon demonstrated mastery. This principle talks about mastery-based progression, right, and which is a core part of competency-based education. And what we know is that when students are pushed forward in their learning without having learned what was expected, whether that's pushed forward between concepts or units or grade levels, their learning gaps grow over time. We're not doing them a favor. We're setting them up to have increasingly difficult hurdles in their learning as they progress. So high-quality competency-based education systems advance students when they have demonstrated mastery. What this does not mean is that they just retain students at the end of the year, right? This does not mean that if a student can't pass all the content of ninth grade, they just do ninth grade over again. This means that schools provide timely and differentiated supports for students before they experience learning gaps or fail to help them develop mastery. It means giving kids multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery, even if they don't succeed the first time, right? Chances to practice again, and finally demonstrate. And it means creating schedules with the flexibility to give students extra time and extra support when, where, and how they need it. So some specific look-fors you might see in a system that's advancing students upon mastery. One is that there are multiple opportunities for assessment. You'll see flexible and personalized learning that are targeting supports for students to help them make progress. And you're going to talk to students and have them tell you that they really know where they are in their learning, and they know what they're doing to move forward. And red flags here might include schools that are using standards-based grading, but still moving students forward without meeting standards. Or, as I mentioned before, schools that are just retaining students and making them fully repeat courses or repeat grade levels when they don't demonstrate mastery. So before I close out and pass this back over, I'll once again share some additional resources that may be of use here. I think, Chris, you may have mentioned a couple of these when you were sharing earlier. One is the Levers and Logic Models paper that Chris referenced, and the reason this can be helpful is that it really focuses on, one, that alignment of all the pieces, as I shared, and can help you and your team think about how to go about the process of designing systems that are fully integrated. And the next is a paper, Moving Toward Mastery, Growing, Developing, and Sustaining Educators for Competency-Based Education. So as you really latched on to that discussion about how we treat educators as learners, this paper will offer some very specific strategies at multiple levels for moving toward that educator learner-centered system. And with that, I'm going to pause here and see if, Susan, there have been any questions in the chat that we may want to make some time for.
Thanks, Catherine. I appreciate it. Please feel free to type in questions in the chat room. We have not had additional questions. For those of you participating on this overall quality framework, if there are questions or insights, areas you're wondering about, please feel free to type those in the chat room, and we're happy to address them.
This is Chris. I did see one regarding information systems and what schools are using. I think it was Marianne, maybe, who asked the question. And things are getting better in terms of information systems. We're still not where we need to be, but also I think our understanding of what a personalized competency-based system continues to develop. So those information system providers are kind of waiting for us, I think, to spell out our specifications even more clearly. But let me just mention a few things. There are schools that are just using grade books, but that doesn't actually usually allow you to monitor learning in the depth that we expect and hope for, but it can help. But there, this summer, or whenever I was there, gosh, February? Whenever I was in Idaho, it was really interesting. I went to two different schools who both used the phrase game changer when speaking about the Summit platform. Now, in all honesty, this is money that's coming through Facebook, so if you use it, you're going to have to expect some backlash around it. But they have been able, they've really applied a lot of engineering talent to figuring out how to have a information system that supports student learning. And you no longer have to do the Summit model exactly. It comes loaded, I believe, with content. You do not have to use that. And if you read this section, the piece on CUNA Middle School, K-U-N-A, they describe, it's a very interdisciplinary middle school program, and they've been actually able to use that Summit platform to help monitor student progress and the students getting feedback about how they're doing in terms of their own pacing and progress. And it was also described as a game changer by Columbia High School. So that's one. Empower continues to develop. That's used by Lindsay and a number of the schools in Maine. It's much higher capacity. It's still a small firm, but they've really worked through the kinks on a lot of different things. And then if you're going towards the models like Building 21, they've been working with a company called Slate. But it's not a product. It's actually that the company fully understands competency-based ed and can help design for you. My understanding is that the big information system providers have been successful in moving towards standards-based systems, but it's still very oriented around the grade level, and it's difficult still to, if you're having students who are working and building up their skills below or above grade level, neither the teacher or the student sort of get recognition for those gains. So it's very much a, did you meet this grade level standard or not? So it's getting better, but it's not where we need to be. But there has been some feedback that the more the field can accumulate their demand, the more we can get the information providers to do what we want. So if you have 5 different schools all using your same information provider, you can put your specifications together and go to them together, and it's more likely they'll do what you're going to need. That's what I've been hearing from people in the field. Anything else, Susan?
Yeah, I would just add that we published a paper that's really focused actually for CIOs and public school districts on information systems and understanding it's different than just listing a list of features that you want, that it's about functional requirements for student-centered learning systems that are competency-based, that do some of those functions that Chris was talking about in having learning progressions over time, not just on age band and grade level and subject boxes, but being able to report out and communicate progress at different stages of proficiency and mastery over time that may be helpful. And I tried typing in the chat room the systems that Chris mentioned in Empower, the use of Slate and Summit there too. So thanks.
Okay, so no other questions? We're going to move on. Okay, that's me. So how are we going to use these quality principles? We obviously put together a lot of ideas, and we had a lot of people helping us in the original technical advisory group that helped put together the ideas from the quality principles. And I just want to highlight 3 different techniques that I have heard about or have used myself in facilitating conversations. And let me start with the first one. And as I'm doing this, if people have other ideas how to use it, or if you've used either the equity principles or the quality principles and so on, please share them with each other. So the first one is from Vermont, and I'm going to actually get you a link. I'm going to do it right now so you guys can look it up. Pat Fitzsimmons sent this to us, and she's from the Department of Education in Vermont. And what she did is she's taken the quality principles, and this is the one for nurture a culture of learning and inclusivity, and basically created a very simple rubric to guide conversation. And she uses a strength-based approach by saying, what do you have as a foundation in your school to build upon for creating nurturing a culture of learning and inclusivity? And what are you currently doing to help nurture that even more? And then she takes the key characteristics from the book and uses those as prompts so that it can get more discrete. So how are you thinking about reflection? How do you build in reflection into your school? How much have you laid the groundwork for a growth mindset? Cultural responsiveness. How much do your teachers have they been supported in developing that capacity? So those are prompts, and then she asked the next question, which is what other principles does this connect with? And this is important because we've outlined 16 principles, which is a lot, I know. But at the same time, what you want to do is start to see how they interact with each other. If you started to think about the science of learning in terms of nurturing a culture of learning and inclusivity, how do those two interact? Because feeling safe and feeling like you belong actually help kids take more risks in their learning. They're going to be willing to try more, right? So those two things start to hinge together. And then she prompts, what do you think about doing in the future? And this becomes a bit of a planning process so that schools can start to think through not only what you might do for this one principle, but for how they intersect with others. And finally, the last one's really, and again, we emphasize getting smart about the traditional system and those flaws. And she asks, what are the elements or beliefs of the traditional system are likely to get in the way or need to change in your school or district? And that's just to prompt people to start to think about those red flag problems, right? Where are those problems of practice going to jump in. So, you know, a great one, you're trying to nurture a culture of learning and inclusivity, and what if your school disciplinary policy is that students are going to be suspended or expelled for behavioral issues, right? If you don't have a restorative practice for most of those behavioral issues that aren't actually putting children at risk, but are just about kids reacting in some ways to the environment they're in, that policy is going to get you into trouble because it's actually sending a message to kids that they don't belong and that they're not scholars and that they're not valued. So that's what you kind of want to start to play against, is what's already in place that's going to undermine this culture. So that's a technique of very light rubric used to prompt people to start thinking. Second one is one that I actually used when I went out with Kelly Brady to Idaho, and we visited, I don't know, 10 schools in 3 days. And I tested this out. We had just finished these quality principles, and I wanted to see how they would work. And so what I did is I created myself my own rubric. It was actually ended up being 3 pages long with all the quality principles in your left-hand column. And then as we visited schools, I would try to jot down exemplars of these principles if there were any red flags. And these were schools that were in 1 year of implementation. So red flags aren't what they're not doing, because there was a lot they weren't doing yet. But if I saw red flags in the actual implementation of what they were trying to do. And then for myself, I'm always trying to bring home what I could share with you all on Competency Works. And so those insights might just be ahas for myself, or ahas for the field, or ahas to bring back to talk with Susan about how the field's developing, where either both in powerful ways or problematic ways. And it actually worked pretty well, but a 3-page rubric is pretty long, and it worked much better with Kelly and I sitting down for a cup of coffee at the end of each day. It helped a little bit on kind of as I was doing the site visits, but I tended to just take my own notes. But it was a very helpful tool for us to exchange thoughts at the end of the day. And the third one, a while back, I actually worked with the Colorado Education Initiative around a facilitated discussion process. And we use the equity principles, but you can use the quality principles just as well. And what we asked is people select one principle from each category. So you had one on culture, one on structure, and one on teaching and learning. And they had an opportunity to read a short description. You wouldn't want to have people reading the 4 or 5 pages in a discussion group, but there would be a short description of that principle. And then what we did is we handed out a couple of case studies from Competency Works. One was, I think, the EPIC schools in New York City, and another one was, I think, Waukesha STEM. But we had a couple of them. And people could pick 2 of those case studies, and they would read them. Again, you could do prep where they read them ahead of time. And then we basically allowed them to have their own facilitated group conversation. Where do they see evidence of these principles in the case studies, and how do they reinforce each other? What are examples from other schools or in their own efforts that are drawing on these design principles? And again, trying to get people to think about where's there going to be problems, right? Because no implementation is perfect. What are examples of those red flags that they saw in the case study, or where implementation just isn't robust enough yet? They might have put some of it in place, but they haven't thought across the principles yet, so that they've only gotten one aspect of something in place. And this actually worked. It was a very quiet meeting, and I was very upset. I was concerned that it wasn't working well, but what we found out is that actually people got a lot out of the process, and the quietness came from that they were so dedicated to thinking and learning. So I think something like this, you can design it to work for your own, would work. So Susan, are there any questions? Let me just ask, are there any examples that you guys have used for these types of kind of quality principles that you would want to share with other people? I see that it's pretty quiet.
And Chris, while people are maybe typing in any examples of how they have used the quality principles, or if they've used them or developed rubrics or or training, while they're thinking about that and adding that to the chat room, there was one question from Susan Fine that I think both you and Catherine may want to address. And it was, can you say more about the educator-centered part of the learning? In professional development and professional learning for success with competency-based ed for educators. And this is an opportunity for sort of a plug here that we are hosting a webinar on January 9th with Katherine Casey on a report she recently released on professional learning and competency-based ed called Moving Toward Mastery, Growing, Developing, and Sustaining Educators for CBE. And I'll just flag that this is one area where we really feel like the field is emerging, but developing, and a lot of energy around, and a lot of interest in the professional learning and competency-based ed, and that report has a number of case studies of where this is starting to happen. So Chris, and then Catherine, can you just say a little bit more about the educator-centered learning piece of this?
Sure. This is Chris. I'm going to say one thing and then turn over to Catherine, who knows much more about this than I do. And what I really just want to say is walking the talk is really important to creating a strong culture. So if teachers are respected, if they have professional learning community time or time for planning and collaborating, if they are given some autonomy, if they're able to work in collaboration, if their facilities and their resources are provided that really respect their and help develop their overall teacher judgment and their capacity, and if they really have time to learn themselves to better serve their own kids, that walking the talk is probably one of the most important things about creating that learning organization that becomes virtuous. But if you hold a set of values and beliefs about how you treat your adults that's different than your kids, you're probably going to get into some trouble. But I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for this question. This is an important one. So, yes, as Susan mentioned, there's a paper that's been released that goes into this very question in a lot of detail, and it thinks specifically about how to really orient the teaching profession toward equity, how to deeply embed learning and learners into professional learning, and then how to make teaching more sustainable as a lifelong career for educators. But your question was really about that sort of learning-centered or learner-centered. So I'll just share a few insights that I gained through my own research and then through work with the technical advisory group. So one, when we talk about student learning in the competency-based system, I know Chris has been a real leader in championing the idea of building around and building on the learning sciences. And there's a lot of information about the learning sciences in that levers and logic models paper, which may be helpful to refer to. But we don't do that for adults, right? We think about engagement, we think about agency and ownership and active learning and transfer and practice and feedback for kids, and we forget to do that for adults. So the first is to really think about to what extent does learning for adults reflect the learning sciences in the same way that it does for kids. A second point I'll bring up is the idea of sustained practice with feedback, right? So often professional learning for adults is one-off and sit and get, as I said a couple of times in this presentation. And part of what we delve into in the paper is what does it look like to help teachers really select areas of focus and how to continue to sustain practice as they work to bring new approaches, new strategies, and new skills into their practice. And we also really highlight the importance of feedback from students, from peers, and from mentors or supervisors as critical to that learning and improvement process. The third is the idea of pathways, right? So we talk about decoupling learning and time for students, right? So that learning isn't bound to seat time, but we don't do that with educators to the same extent. And so the paper highlights a number of pretty successful innovations in developing competency-based teacher pathways that allow teachers to pick a direction, chart a course in their own learning, and demonstrate mastery along the way. And micro-credentials are an increasingly popular and important way of getting at that. And then the very final one that I'll reference quickly, just because Chris, I believe, mentioned it, was the idea of collaboration. And so often, I'll ask a principal or someone in a position of leadership about teacher collaboration in their school, and they'll say, oh yeah, we have monthly release days and meeting times, right? Which is just like that's some collaboration time. That's not a culture of collaboration. So part of what the paper looks at is some examples in schools and districts around the country that have really been successful at embedding teacher collaboration as a core part of what it means to be a teacher, often right down to classroom instruction, right? Collaborative classroom instruction. And so I think that's a really important part as well. I will stop there because I know we're nearing the end of our time, and that was a pretty long answer, but I hope it was helpful, and please feel free to reach out if you want to discuss this more. It's something I'd love to talk and think about.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Okay, so I think we can wrap up. I don't think there's any other questions that I saw. There was somebody asking about where to start with all the papers that are now on Competency Works. I do think the quality one is probably both the most comprehensive and has the most clear explanations. It's the levers and logic models definitely has sections in it and can be a guide going forward for a long period of time. I would start with those two. And I think what we're going to see is more and more people trying to figure out how to make it easier for people to understand. What I do want to do right now is thank both Catherine and Susan for helping to do this webinar. But I also want to now introduce Elliot Levine, who is the new research director at INACOL and will be managing Competency Works. And there is his email for anybody who wants to get in touch. And so starting January 1, Elliot will be your contact for Competency Works and everything competency-based ed. So I wish you all a great afternoon and happy holidays for all that you celebrate. And I think that's it. Anything else, Susan, you'd like to say?
I would just like to give you a huge thank you, Chris, for all of your leadership in the field of competency-based ed, and this is our last formal event together for Competency Works. So on behalf of the entire field, thank you so much for your leadership, and I know we'll be in touch after the new year. We wish you the very best. So Catherine, Chris, thank you for today's webinar. Thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season and a new year. Thank you.